Today, I would like to talk about Eugène Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, but I do not want to start with the text of the play. I want to start with the life that produced it. With Ionesco, biography is not just background information, it is almost the substance out of which his theatre grows. The strange absurdist images that dominate the play Rhinoceros, which are herds of people turning into beasts, the sudden eruption of something monstrous into the everyday life of the town, the loneliness of the one person who refuses to join, and the collapse of language into clichés. All of it is rooted very directly in the experiences of the author himself. He had a divided childhood between Romania and France, saw the rise of fascism in Eastern Europe, and also him feeling like an outsider and the deep metaphysical shock that he suffered as a child are all contributing factors to this play. Therefore, to understand the play Rhinoceros properly, we need to see how all of that becomes theatre. But before we enter Unesco's life, let me just briefly sketch the larger historical and literary context for our better understanding. UNESCO's formative years fall between the two world wars and then into the Second World War. Europe, in this period, is a continent full of extreme political movements. On one side, you have authoritarian and fascist movements, which are Nazism in Germany under Hitler, fascism in Italy under Mussolini, and closer to UNESCO's own world, we have the Iron Guard in Romania, which is a violently nationalist and anti Semitic movement. On the other side of this, you have the hardline communist regimes, especially under Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now, what all of these have in common is the certain herd mentality. Now, what do we mean by the herd mentality? It is basically, we can easily define it as the tendency of large groups of people to give up their own individual judgment and follow a leader or an ideology blindly. So, here we have ordinary citizens who are beginning to accept things such as hatred, persecution, and violence that they would have normally or they would have earlier found unthinkable. And they are accepting this simply because everyone else seems to be moving in that direction. Therefore, that herd mentality is what we are talking about here. This phenomenon, this frightening ease with which people join a collective madness, this is what is at the very center of Rhinoceros, where human beings are literally turning into herd animals. This play is about rhinoceraitis, a fictional disease of mass conversion, and UNESCO had watched something very similar happen in real life. Another important point to note is that UNESCO is one of the leading figures of what critics, especially Martin Eslin, called the theatre of the absurd. The term theatre of the absurd refers to a group of post war dramatists like Beckett, Adamov, UNESCO himself, who felt that traditional realist theatre, with its clear plots and psychologically well rounded characters, was no longer adequate to express the disorientation, meaninglessness, and anxieties that people experienced after the catastrophes of the world wars in the 20th century. Eslin, drawing on Albert Camus, using absurd to mean a clash between two things. Firstly, the human need for meaning, order, and explanation, and secondly, a universe that seems indifferent, silent, and chaotic. The theatre of the absurd does not just talk about this clash, it makes us feel it formally through circular, repetitive dialogues rather than linear conversations, through broken, non logical plots, through strange, exaggerated situations, and through language that often collapses into cliches or nonsense. UNESCO is central to this movement, but he is not simply a follower of any one philosopher. UNESCO rejects the label existentialist and he is wary of turning philosophy into drama as lecture. His particular version of the absurd is strongly linguistic and biographical, and the play Rhinoceros will be our main example of that. Now, with this minimal framework in place, we can learn about his life. Eugène Ionesco, born in 1909, comes into the world already stretched between two cultures. He was born in a small town in Romania to a Romanian father and a mother of mixed French and Romanian background. Very soon after his birth, the family moves to Paris, where his father studies law. So, his first language experiences, the first streets he remembers, the first scenes of culture, and home for him are all French. Then, war and family breakdown changes everything. During the First World War, his father returns to Romania. Eventually, his parents' marriage collapses and they divorce. His mother, struggling in France, finally takes the children back to Romania. When UNESCO is around 13, she leaves him and his sister in his father's care over there. So the child, who has grown up feeling French, finds himself abruptly transplanted to Romania, a country that is both his father's homeland and for him curiously foreign. He must adapt to a language and a culture that he only half knows. In France, he had been the Romanian boy. In Romania, he becomes the half French boy. He never feels completely at home in either place. Later, he writes in French and becomes canonically French, but always with this sense of double exile, of being an outsider both linguistically and culturally. This bicultural displaced childhood will matter very much for the play Rhinoceros, which is a play about belonging and non belonging, about the one who cannot or will not join the community when it rushes in a particular direction. UNESCO's life trains him from adolescence to look at societies from the edge, to notice the rituals and also their pressures to conform. There's this one episode from his childhood that left a particularly deep mark on him, and he returned to it several times in his autobiographical writings. It goes like walking alone in a quiet French village under a piercing blue sky, surrounded by whitewashed walls, he suddenly feels overwhelmed by light, by an almost mystical sense of joy, harmony, and meaning. For a brief moment, everything appears luminous, complete, and extraordinarily alive, and then, just as abruptly, the feeling disappears. The very same scene now strikes him as dirty, decaying, and suffocating. He becomes intensely aware of the corruption, rot, and death. The world flips from revelation to horror. This double experience leaves two deep obsessions in him. Firstly, a longing for some inaccessible city of light, some realm of ultimate meaning that forever recedes. And secondly, a dark, constant awareness that everything is perishable, that death and decay are always just beneath the surface of the daily life. You can hear this clearly in the play Rhinoceros when the protagonist Bérenger says, there are more dead people than living, and their numbers are increasing. The living are getting rarer. For UNESCO, this is not just rhetoric, it is an expression of a sense of reality that goes back to that childhood shock. The rhinoceroses rampaging through an otherwise ordinary town are like that sudden eruption of the other side of existence into the familiar everyday world. Moving on, in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, UNESCO studies French literature at the University of Bucharest. These are years of intense political radicalization in Romania. The far right Iron Guard movement emerges and gains influence. It combines ultra nationalism, orthodox mysticism, and violent anti Semitism. Many young people, including some intellectuals, are influenced by its rhetoric of national purity and spiritual renewal. Public life becomes increasingly polarized, liberal and democratic values are eroded. UNESCO stands to a larger extent apart from this. He watches with horror as friends, colleagues, and admired professors slowly adopt extremist positions. People who had once argued for reason and tolerance are now beginning to speak in slogans. The anti Semitic attitudes, which were once only marginal, now move into the mainstream of the educated society. Violence and hatred are being rationalized as necessary and even noble. He later describes this experience in a memorable image. He says it was as if his friends' shoes were turning into hooves and their gloves into paws as they metamorphosed into beasts. In other words, he experiences ideological conversions as a kind of moral and spiritual dehumanization. It is not difficult to see how this flows into Rhinoceros. The play stages exactly this process. Citizens in a small town transform one by one into rhinoceroses. At first, the phenomena is shocking. Then it becomes normal. Finally, it is admired. People who previously seemed civilized now run in a herd, knock down walls, and trumpet violently. We can see how UNESCO is not just inventing a grotesque fantasy over here. He is dramatizing what he had already witnessed, which is the gradual animalization of thought and behavior under the pressure of a collective movement. There's a powerful statement of his where he explains the choice of the animal. When people no longer share your opinions, when you can no longer make yourself understood by them, one has the impression of being confronted with monsters. Rhinos, for example. They have that mixture of candor and ferocity. They would kill you with the best of conscience. This particular mixture of candor and ferocity, the rhino's innocence and violence, it captures what terrified UNESCO in fascist enthusiasm. People could sincerely believe they were doing the right thing while committing horrors. These experiences fix in UNESCO a profound suspicion of all rigid ideologies, that is, all the grand isms fascism, communism, doctrine, liberalism, and so on. By ideology here, he means a closed system of ideas that claims to explain everything, whether it is history, society, or morality, and that demands total loyalty from its followers. He has seen up close how such systems can operate like collective illness. In his critical writings, he calls them serious collective diseases passed off as ideas. This is exactly the formulation he echoes in his preface to Rhinoceros, where he speaks of mass ideological conversions as a kind of epidemic. This skepticism shapes his position within French intellectual life. Unlike Jean-Paul Sartre, who famously argues for a committed theatre that should promote political engagement and clear ideological positions, UNESCO mistrusts theatre that becomes didactic or propagandistic. He does not want his plays to tell the audience what to think. He wants them to experience the instability of meaning and the horror of mass conformity. So, in Rhinoceros, on one level, it is unmistakably a critique of fascism, Nazism, and of the Romanian Iron Guard ideology. On another level, it is also kind of a warning about any collective movement, on the right or the left, in which people stop thinking and simply start going with the flow, or we can say in this particular case, following the herd mentality. The disease, rhinoceritis, becomes a symbol for this wider recurring human tendency. As Europe moves towards the Second World War, UNESCO returns to France on a scholarship. This move allows him to escape Romania just as it plunges deeper into fascist violence. During the early 1940s, he works for Romanian Cultural Services in France, the collaborationist regime that governed part of France under the Nazi domination. His tasks involve cultural diplomacy and propaganda. So basically, writing reports, organizing exchanges, producing texts that present Romania in a favorable light. Later, he distances himself from the regime and from those years. But what matters for our purpose is what he observes there. He sees how official language, that is, government slogans, bureaucratic phrases, and diplomatic cliches, can be used to mask reality. Behind the polite speeches and cultural events lie acts of persecution, censorship, and collaboration with Nazi policies. This disjunction between the tone of public discourse and the substance of what is actually happening deepens his distrust of language. This is a key step towards his later exploration of the emptiness of everyday speech and the way language can become detached from truth. After the war, Ionesco settles permanently in France. He does not immediately become a famous playwright. Instead, he works as a proofreader in a law publishing office in Paris. The atmosphere of this particular law publishing firm is something like mountains of legal texts, minute corrections, and regulations, the ultra precise but soulless world of the legal language. Around him, the small dramas of office life, gossip, petty rivalries, pretended seriousness over trivial matters is what he encounters. Meanwhile, the larger world is dealing with the memory of genocide, with the Cold War, with the new fear of nuclear annihilation. This office experience goes straight into Rhinoceros. In Act 2, we find Bérenger working in precisely such a publishing office. In the play, while we see rhinoceroses crashing through the town and civilization seems to be collapsing, his colleagues argue about the details. Details such as whether the rhinoceroses are Asian or African, who is late, or who is responsible for what action. The skeptical clerk Botard tries to explain away the phenomenon as collective psychosis or a political hoax, even as the building is shaking. The banality of the office and the catastrophe outside are deliberately juxtaposed. Ionesco is showing us how human beings can remain trapped in narrow routines even when their world is literally cracking. At the same time, this period shapes his theoretical stance towards traditional drama. He attacks what he calls bourgeoisie drama, plays that mirror the respectable surface of the middle class society, with coherent plots and psychologically realistic characters. For him, such realism actually falsifies reality because it filters out the fundamental anxieties, contradictions, and obsessions. He sums this up pretty memorably, saying, realism falls short of reality. It shrinks it, attenuates it, falsifies it. It does not take into account our basic truths and our fundamental obsessions. Therefore, in response, he develops the idea of the anti play. Works such as The Lesson, The Chairs, which deliberately violate the rules of conventional drama. Plots disintegrate, language spirals into nonsense, characters become puppet like. These pieces are designed not to reassure the audience with recognizable stories, but to expose the void beneath social conventions. Intellectually, UNESCO is influenced by some of the currents that shape existentialism, but he refuses to be classified as an existentialist playwright. When we talk about existentialism, especially in the form of Sartre, it is a philosophy that centers on individual freedom, responsibility, and the creation of meaning in a world without given values. Sartre believes that through our choices we define ourselves, and he sees theatre as a tool to explore and communicate these ideas. Absurdism, in the same sense used by Albert Camus and then by Eslin, emphasized the gap between our longing for meaning and the indifference or silence of the universe. It does not necessarily offer clear solutions, it often stops at the level of confrontation. UNESCO is closer to Camus' absurd than to Sartre's didactic existentialism. He thinks that the theatre Sartre is referring to is too rational and too discursive, too much like philosophy dressed up as drama. UNESCO, by contrast, wants to stage the feeling of absurdity and not explain it away. What makes his contribution distinctive is that he locates the absurd inside language and theatrical form. He shows conventions dissolving into repetition and nonsense. He shows logical structures like the logician syllogisms in Rhinoceros becoming grotesque and meaningless. He also uses circular structures and escalating absurdity to make the spectator experience disorientation. So, while his plays are certainly about the human existence in a hostile or indifferent world, they are also about the failure of language and the instability of representation itself. By the late 1950s, when UNESCO writes Rhinoceros, which was published in 1959, he is already recognized as the leading figure of avant garde theatre. His early anti plays have established his anti mimetic program, which is break free from conventional realism, destroy cliches, and show the void. Rhinoceros marks a development, even a partial compromise. It retains many absurdist devices such as sudden transformations, repetitions, strange logical games, but it also introduces a more psychologically continuous character, especially Bérenger, a more recognizable setting, which is a small provincial town, and a more overtly political dimension, the allegory of mass conversion. Yet, it never collapses into simple allegory or propaganda. UNESCO is very explicit that he does not want rhinoceros is equals to Nazi to be the end of our reading. His direct experience of Nazi and fascist movements is the starting point, but he insists the play is about broader phenomena, that is, the collective hysteria, the herd instinct, and the seduction of anonymity. In other words, Rhinoceros is not only about the 1930s and 1940s, it is also about the permanent human temptation to give up thinking and to join the crowd, whatever the crowd happens to believe at the time. It is very helpful to think of Bérenger, the central character of Rhinoceros, as a kind of alter ego for UNESCO. At the beginning of the play, Bérenger is far from heroic. He is careless, often drunk, disorganized, deeply insecure. He is not one of the brilliant intellectuals. In fact, he represents the ordinary confused person who drifts through life without clear convictions. He even confesses at one point, I sometimes wonder if I exist myself. That line resonates very strongly with UNESCO's own metaphysical anxieties and his sense of not belonging fully anywhere, neither in Romania nor in France, neither within religious belief nor within confident atheism. And yet, precisely because he does not fit nearly into any ideological group, Beringer ultimately becomes the only one who resists the epidemic of rhinocerositis. His weakness, his marginality, his awkwardness are transformed by the end of the play into a kind of a stubborn moral strength. One final biographical thread that runs directly into the play Rhinoceros is UNESCO's lifelong mistrust of cliches and official language. By this point in his life, he had been a witness to the fascist propaganda in Romania, also worked in a minor functionary in Vichy France's diplomatic machinery, and been a proofreader in a legal publishing house. Again and again, we see that UNESCO had seen how language was used not to reveal reality but to hide it. This is why he attacks conventional realistic theatre with its apparent natural dialogue. He argues that such realism presents a comfortable, a tidy picture of life that ignores the underlying chaos, fear, and absurdity. True theatre for UNESCO should show the unreality of the real. That is, it should reveal how artificial and fragile our everyday routines and phrases really are. In the play Rhinoceros, this obsession appears in both comic and disturbing ways. First of all, when the first rhinoceros runs through the townspeople launch into pedantic arguments. They question, was it a one-horned or a two-horned rhinoceros? Was it Asian or African? So, instead of confronting the existential shock, which would be human beings having turned into beasts, they are debating taxonomy, which is absurd in itself. Secondly, in the office, Bota treats the phenomenon as a kind of a media hoax or collective psychosis long after his own building is shaking. His vocabulary, consisting of the words like hoax, provocation, fabrication, all of this feels eerily like the language of denial which we hear whenever unpleasant truths appear in public life. Finally, we also have the logician's absurd syllogisms, where he says, all cats are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a cat. Now, this is a clear mockery of the misapplication of rational structures to irrational realities. All of this flows very naturally from Unesco's biography. The man who read legal codes by day and watched ideological speeches by night had every reason to suspect that language, far from being transparent, was a dangerous and unreliable medium.